John, thanks for having me.
So you have your third movie coming out on this whole phenomena of debt, and more debt. It's just mind-boggling. But I wanted to talk to you in more general terms as well about that whole phenomena, and we're going to dig into that. I mean, if you really think about it, the globe, economists, analysts, governments, doomsayers have been talking about debt. Oh my gosh, since the 1960s for millennia. But we're still here. The world hasn't crashed. I have breakfast in the morning. I go to the beach in the summer. So are we in the Netherlands or something?
That's a good question. Yeah, David Stockman's in the film, and he was Ronald Reagan's budget director.
And
So
let me stop you
back
there.
in the
This is
80s,
the movie we're talking about. Which movie, David Stockman? Which one is
yeah,
that?
so the whole cast is in all three films. What we
Yep.
did is the premise, I guess I'll start with the premise. So the premise was to track down people that predicted the housing crash, ask them why it happened and what's next. And that kind of led me to all these other things. Like I didn't know about the Federal Reserve before I started this project. I didn't know about Austrian economics. And I knew a little bit about economics, but I really didn't realize the scope of everything that was going on. But so we shot all these interviews, and the first film, The Housing Bubble, looks at the past. It, looks at the whole last century, really, but mainly on the run up to the housing bubble. The second film, The Fall of 2008, which just came out, and we're premiering it this June at Freedom Fest. Um, that one focuses on the responses to the crash back in 2008, 2009, the bailouts and stimulus. And then the third film is The Bigger Bubble, which looks at more of these bigger picture things and looks forward, and really focuses a lot on the quantitative easing of the 2010s, all the money creation that they were doing. Um, but yeah, so to your point, David Stockman back in the 80s was kind of sounding the war cry on all this. But back then we were kind of at the beginning. We have these booms and busts, the dot-com bubble, the housing bubble, what some people call the everything bubble that we have now. But there's also more longer term trends that are happening. So yes, like each bubble has gotten bigger these last 25 years, and it's kind of like they're getting to the end game of that. But if you go back to the 80s, we were really at the beginning of, a 45-year bull, generally bull run in the bond market. They had all this inflation in the 70s, and then Paul Volcker wisely allowed interest rates to go back up. And in the early 80s, they peaked out. But since then, because the United States has been the world reserve currency, and since there's been this huge, trend toward lower interest rates, that's kind of allowed us, especially the world reserve currency thing, that's allowed us to print money and get away with it because all these other countries were using dollars. So we kind of exported inflation overseas. But what we've seen recently is they can't push interest rates down forever. And as we've seen the stock market volatility with all these tariffs, which I think tariffs are a terrible thing, and that's something we cover during the Great Depression sequence in the first
Mm.
film. But what we've seen is normally people flee when they're getting out of the stock market, they go to the safest thing, and that's supposedly the United States debt and government bonds in the U.S. And what we saw with this recent volatility is that's not necessarily always the case. And if people make their portfolio assumptions based on the idea that everybody's just going to keep coming back to the US no matter what the situation, it puts them in a lot of danger and also exposes them to the inflation that we've seen here in these last few years.
I want to provide some stats, so to give a sense of where we're at right now. Global debt has been estimated at over 300 trillion. I don't really feel anybody has a total grasp on that. That's an estimate. Who knows? It could be
Right.
twice that for all we know. Here in the US, we have 1.2 trillion dollars on credit card balances. US student debt 1.74 trillion and rising. National debt, what is it? 35 trillion. The interest payments on the US debt, I believe, exceeds spending on military. Somebody estimated that maybe the real debt in America is, could this be possible? In the multiple trillions, could have run into 200 trillion, maybe more when you take municipal debt, unfunded liabilities. So we're awash in debt. Um, Sort of try to make sense of all of this. When did all this, when did this whole debt spiral begin? Some people trace it to the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, a banker's bank, if you will. And then we came into the 1920s, which were known as the Roaring Twenties, because we had this sort of, as my friend John Harvard would call it, frenetic consumption. Everything was on credit and so on. And that inevitably burst, went into the 1930s. Um, but that whole debt kept building. And then in the 1950s, we saw the arrival of the early credit card culture. I believe Diner's card was the first sort of popular credit card in America, probably held by celebrities, Frank Sinatra and everything, when they were dining, as the term suggests. And then we really got into the U.S. To the use of credit cards. I would imagine probably by the late 60s, 70s. So that's an interesting kind of dividing line. Pre 1950, really no credit cards. Post 1950, credit cards and escalating debt. It's kind of it is a frightening scenario.
Yeah, it really is. And we cover it pretty extensively in the first film. Like you were talking about with the creation of the Federal Reserve. In the 1910s, that gave the government this huge new source of revenue where they were able to just print money to finance the war. And as we've seen with military spending over the years, we've gotten to the point now where we'll do a 20, 25-year war. And, the people don't see that they're directly paying for it because we're printing the money. And so, yes, like they're getting higher prices and stuff, but they don't necessarily connect the cost of the war to the war itself, unfortunately. But yeah, in the first film, we go over, with the Great Depression, FDR started to cut the link to gold. They made everybody turn in your gold. If you didn't do so, you faced fines and imprisonment. And the fines weren't like, it wasn't a joke. It was like the modern day equivalent of a couple $100,000. And so everybody turned in their gold to the government, and you couldn't redeem your dollars for gold. The idea of a dollar was just meant to be a certificate representing a specific amount of gold. And after the 1930s, 1946, they had the Bretton Woods Agreement, which was basically this international order that I was talking about, where the US dollar is the world reserve currency. And so the idea was we can't turn in our dollars for gold, but since other countries aren't going to go along with this, other countries could turn their dollars, their US dollars, and actually get gold back. But what we found was over the 50s and then particularly in the 60s with the Great Society wanting to have all this welfare spending while at the same time having the Vietnam War, the mission to the moon, all these things. They were printing money to do that, and so when other countries started trying to redeem their dollars, there was a run, like a bank run, except on the dollar. And so that's why Richard Nixon is known for actually severing the link to gold, because then he said, not just temporarily, that the other countries wouldn't be able to do that. And here we are all these years later. But I guess what you were talking about with the beginning of debt and all that, like, yes, these things were a factor, but as far as like the growth of the banks and the bank debt that's really driving all this, in my opinion, I think the
Mm.
real problem was Alan Greenspan. And I'm not just talking about the dot-com bubble and the housing bubble. Like, he actually became Federal Reserve Chairman in the mid 80s. And contrary to what Paul Volcker had done, where he allowed interest rates to rise, we had the S&L crash. And his response to that was, we're going to intervene, we're going to bail out banks, we're going to tell banks that, even if you took all this risk, we're going to back you up. The United States government is going to back you up. And what that did is it gave all these incentives. In economics, they call it moral hazard, but it gave all these incentives for banks to go out and, create all this debt because it didn't matter if people could pay it back. And so in 1997, Alan Greenspan had this famous speech. We call it the irrational exuberance speech, where he basically kind of gave a wink and a nod to Wall Street saying, look, guys, like, have at it. I got you. And that's when the dot-com bubble really started taking off. And so when the dot-com bubble crashed, Alan Greenspan didn't want to deal with the short-term problems of having to correct from all those bad investments. And he intervened and he lowered interest rates down to 1% for a whole year in 2003. And that, in my opinion, we talk about the other factors as well in the documentary, and I don't think the banks are completely innocent. But the main driver was him lowering interest rates all the way down to 1%. Like we hadn't done that to that extent. And then coupling that with telling the banks, not only are you getting all this free printed money, but later on, if shit hits the fan, like we're gonna bail you out. And so the housing crash was a unique case where usually in a recession, you might have some sort of correction with housing prices and other things, but housing just kept taking off. So they replaced that dot-com bubble with the housing bubble. And I guess since we're talking about that specific period, I do want to add, Fannie and Freddie were a huge part of this, where the government was guaranteeing that debt. And, people would say, oh, it's not really a guarantee. But as we found in 2008, like, yes, they were guaranteeing that. They weren't just guaranteeing mortgage debt, they were guaranteeing pretty much everything, like even mutual funds got bailed out. And so what happened by responding to the dot-com bubble that way and then responding to the housing crash that way is it sent a signal not just here in the US but all over the world that debt is good. We're going to lower interest rates. We're going to encourage debt. We don't want to encourage savings and investment. We want to encourage spending. We're going to build our economy around just spending money and borrowing money. And so since 2008, the banks are bigger. There's fewer of them because of all the regulations they had with Dodd-Frank. And worldwide, other central banks emulated what we were doing. And so all these debt problems have just gone completely out of control. And so earlier you were saying, people have been talking about this for a long time, yet here I am having your coffee. And that's absolutely true. But at the same time, in these last few years, people have seen, oh, wait, my coffee isn't $1 anymore. So
Yeah.
you have these two things happening where you have the economy being, you have the price inflation, like I just mentioned, but then the other big thing is the economy is just so distorted. Everything's built on a house of cards of debt and money printing. And yeah, we were able to, delay the crash from the dot-com bubble by creating $1 billion a day in 2003. But after that, in the 2010s, we had to print $3 billion a day. And that created all these problems that we're having now. And just think if when COVID had hit, if we had taken the opposite response. I actually just interviewed Gary
Mm,
Johnson for my podcast.
mm,
He was the governor of New Mexico and ran for president back
mhm.
in 2012 and 2016. In 2012, he was talking about cutting federal spending by 43% to balance the budget. And if
Wow.
he had done that, yeah, and if he had done that, just imagine where we would have been when COVID hit. Like, if they weren't discouraging savings and encouraging spending, imagine if people weren't living paycheck to paycheck and
Mm,
were actually able to have like a little cushion. And it's funny about the COVID response too, because we kind of make the joke, mocking the response to 2008 with the stimulus bills and everything. Like the idea that, well, if this is really the best response, then why don't we just not work? Why don't we just have everybody go home and we'll just print the money and pay them to not work? And then in 2020, that was actually the policy.
mm,
Like
mm.
that's literally what they did.
Yeah, yeah, it was kind of a dry run with the concept of a universal basic income. In a sense, it was a very weird time,
Right.
and the consensus seems to be forming now that COVID was a sham, and notwithstanding the loss of lives, which is terrible tragedy,
Hmm.
we get all that, but even the measures we took were really far fetched, if you will, and we shut down
Yeah, the
businesses.
lockdown. The lockdowns are the sham, right?
you know. There's a couple of things that occur to me. One, consumers' personal responsibility on this. There's nothing to stop any responsible person saying, I'm not going to load up on debt. I'm going to save a little longer and pay more down on my mortgage, maybe pay my house off faster, and the hell with the government. So there is that aspect maybe that's missing here.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And there were people that did that and they were forced to pay for the mistakes of others. And it socializes that risk and those costs. And the problem with these booms and busts is I'm guilty of it, of course. But when you're focused on the bust and the crash, you miss out on the boom. And the truth is, obviously with what stocks have done the last 15 years and what housing did in the early 2000s, like if you miss out on the bubble, then everybody else is out there making all that money. And so even if you do well during the crash, like you're having to play catch up. And so the truth is that yes, that's absolutely right. Like there were banks that made good decisions, like John Allison's bank. But at the end of the day, like they're still forced to pay those costs for the other people. And they built this system and aligned every incentive to, if like, let's say, for example, if they took the price of coffee and said, we're gonna just have the government mandate that the coffee is 50 cents, like, is it your fault for going out there and buying that 50-cent coffee and taking advantage of that? Or is it really their fault for manipulating the situation and then creating shortages by having an artificial price?
Jimmy, you've interviewed a lot of influential people, very wealthy people, some of the world's richest people for your three movies, and I want to repeat them again: The Housing Bubble, that was came out in 2019, Fall of 2008, which premieres soon, and then the upcoming The Bigger Bubble. If you could summarize it for me, what is their primary concern? Some of these are billionaires, so there's a feeling out there among some critics that, oh, these guys never lose. They're on one side or the other, and they're hedged so well. Why would they be so cared? If they're worried, well, we need to be worried. So maybe walk me through that.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, these are people that they're not doing these interviews with me because I'm going to make them a ton of money. Like they believe in these ideas. Peter Schiff, Jim Rogers, Doug Casey, Ron Paul, David Stockman, Jim Grant. Those are the financial people. We also had Gene Epstein from Barron's, and then we had economists, great economists like Joe Salerno, Mark Thornton, Roger Garrison, Jeff Herbener, Patrick Barron. So we have a bunch of people in this project. But I think for them, they're trying to help people, honestly, and they're trying to just educate as many people as they can because it's nice having all those things, but if your neighbor's committing suicide because his bank just collapsed, you're not necessarily in the world you want to be. And so they're trying to educate as many people as possible so they can protect themselves from these bubbles. And that's really why I got into it, was because I had started a house painting business to fund my film projects in 2006, 2007, and it was right at the peak of the housing bubble. So I didn't predict it. I watched it unwind and saw the effects of it. And that's what gave me the idea that like I should track down people that predicted it. I read Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt, and he had written in the 1940s that basically describing how it happened. And so I thought, okay, there's got to be more of these people out here. And so I teamed up with Tom Woods, who had a New York Times best-selling book on it, and reached out to these people and was able to get these interviews. And the thing that the greatest takeaway for it for me is the number one thing that I heard from these people is when I would ask them when's the crash going to happen, that sort of thing, is I don't know. Despite all the success that Jim Rogers has had, and like him, for example, his first 10 years, the stock market went up 50%. And his portfolio went up 4,200%. And so he retired at 37, became the first person to cross China on a motorcycle, and then traveled the entire world on a motorcycle. I'm talking Siberia, Sahara Desert, all of it. And so these are very interesting people. But But my point is, even Jim Rogers says, I don't know. All I'm telling you is these are the consequences, these are the effects. And in our films, they're economics films. They're not political. We're not looking at people's intentions, what they're trying to do. We're saying these are the causes, these are the effects, and where we want to give you the tools so you are educated, so you can make your own decisions moving forward on the best path forward, the best way to protect yourself. And so, yes, these people are trying to educate people. Yes, they've been really successful. But honestly, I was really surprised with how much humility they had in understanding that nobody can predict an economy of millions and billions of people. And, especially like the United States, you can't manage an economy of 300 million people and say, oh, this guy on this committee is going to decree interest rates are going to be this percent. It doesn't work. It's socialist.
So these ultra wealthy people and the ranks of the rich have gotten richer, and the middle class have been, um, is disappearing, and the poor are sort of getting poorer. That whole divide is widening because of our policies, I would think, or people have suggested. So, how are the super rich preparing for what seems like the inevitable, or it won't be the inevitable if we take the necessary steps, which we can discuss. But how do the rich, the real rich, hedge their bets? Real estate, land, commodities. What do they do?
Yeah, Jim Rogers is big on agriculture, commodities, gold and silver, all of them really. Their focus is gold and silver, just as a way of protecting you. Because historically, gold and silver has been money for thousands of years, and it's protected against when they try to create money. In the first film, we go back to the Byzantine Empire and the Romans and all that. And what they would do is they couldn't print money, but they would clip the coins. And so they would take a gold coin and cut the edge of it off and then melt that down and make another coin. And so it's the same causes and effects even back then. But gold and silver has been, obviously it's had a big run recently, which is a sign that, probably things behind the scenes are worse than we realize.
Mm.
But gold and silver has outperformed the stock market if you go back to 2007,
Yeah.
2006, if you go to the peak right before the housing crash, if you go back to the peak right before the dot-com crash, gold has outperformed the stock market. That shouldn't happen. Gold and silver is a way of saving money. It's not meant to be this speculative investment, but when they print this much
Yeah.
money, it becomes that. And so, a lot of them have pointed to gold and silver stocks as if you're wanting to be more risky, gold and silver being the safe investment, and gold and silver stocks or gold funds being a more speculative, be willing to lose your money because it's a lot more volatile, but if it goes, then it's going to go big. And honestly, they've kind of done real poorly these last 10, 15 years as this bubble has gone on longer than everyone thought it would. So, we might be seeing signs that that's going to turn. But I also, am not here going to tell somebody that's retiring tomorrow, like, hey, put all your money in gold and silver stocks. I think you do have to diversify and everything. But really, what our documentaries are trying to do is give people the tools to make their own decisions. Like give you the education you need so that when you pick your money manager, you can have an educated conversation with him or her. Or if you're talking to your neighbor about this stuff, you can actually know, okay, yes, I can talk about these things, but I also have the context of what happened in the 30s and what happened in the 70s and all that stuff I was talking about with Alan Greenspan. I think the documentaries really elevate the discussion. And what I love about it is, let's say you watch them with your father or your son or your friend. How many times have people tried to have discussions about the economy or these issues, and you just spend the whole time trying to fit an hour worth of information into a few sentences? You're
Mm.
trying to get them on the same level as you, not necessarily agreeing on everything, but at least knowing what the hell you're talking about. And so what these do is you can sit down, watch a movie for an hour, and really take away our key principles with any of the films. You can watch them in any order. And then if they get interested, they can go back and watch the rest. But by doing that, man, you sit down and you have a conversation after watching this movie, and they're talking about, oh, I agreed with this and this, like I love this. But the thing I have a hang up on, because everybody likes to point out what they disagree with, and the point I have a hang up on is this scene. And so then you spend your time actually discussing the issues on a high level instead of just trying to pack in a whole education just to start the conversation off and never get to the actual debate or discussion.
I listened recently to a fascinating interview with a former Wall Street executive, very high ranking, but she's studied what's going on in the globe. And she has this, it might be a conspiracy theory, but a lot of people would hold the same view that a lot of what we're seeing in the globe is driven by central banks and it's about controlling the masses, as it were. And they want to elevate that to a new higher level. And, we saw that in the activities of the US central bank, as you described there earlier. And we may be getting into the era of, central bank digital currency, where in essence, the bankers of the world can control commerce, as it were. And I'm just wondering where that could go, Jimmy. Have you any thoughts? It often occurred to me that if we went over the cliff, one of the one of the things central banks potentially could do is say to consumers, look, surrender your personal freedom and we'll take the notes to your home, your mortgage, we'll run everything and we'll pay your bills. But you're not going to have a lot of freedom. We just have to tell you how to conduct your life. And it'll be a very autocratic, boring, scientific, joyless, lacking in color and culture even.
Absolutely. I mean, it's really terrifying when you think about the implications. And I think a good microcosm of it was the drug war. Like you see it with the drug war, where even these states that have legal marijuana, none of those companies have bank accounts. Everything is done through cash because it's still legal on the federal level. And so, whether it's government making private decisions about whether you're purchasing marijuana or things like that, or if it's COVID or the how you want to treat yourself to COVID, that sort of thing. I mean, we really saw, there's kind of this stereotype of marijuana users of that, they don't, some of them don't go outside, they're just playing video games, they're at home, they're not going out. And part of that is because if they go out, they're spending billions of dollars on a police force all across the country that's trying to arrest them. So of course you're gonna have people afraid to go out. And then we saw that with COVID and the response to that. I mean, it was basically the whole population got a taste of what it was like to be a victim of the drug war, where you're afraid to go outside and the government's micromanaging you. One of the things I'm really proud about is our first film we premiered in uh, we actually premiered in 2018, but it wasn't quite
Mm.
finished. So our real premiere and digital release was June 2019. We had a big event in New York City with Jim Grant and Peter Schiff and some others. But then our films came out in November on Blu-ray and DVD. So we were all set to like go to theaters across the country. We had stuff set up in Canada, and that's how we really were going to promote these films. And then they decided that movie theaters weren't too essential, and they literally just shut down all the movie theaters in the country. Not all of them, but most states. So we did do one screening in Knoxville, Tennessee, in 2020, and I went to a bar in California and sold copies. Tom Woods spoke there with Mark Skousen, and the week before, the bar had been shut down by the
Oh
government. They shut them down,
gosh.
they fined them, and they kept reopening. But one of the things I'm proud of is in that first film, we talk about that. We talk about how in World War II, the government, and these are the words they used in World War II, the government decided what was essential business and non-essential business.
Hmm.
And so to be aware of that, and obviously we weren't able to stop anything the government's been doing, but as an individual, being aware of that stuff, I think it really prepares you for it and allows you to get out and protect yourself in any way that you can.
Um, the name of your film production company is Let Us Disagree, I believe. I agree with
Right.
you on lots of what you're saying, Jimmy. I will digress on the marijuana. I'm not a proponent of legalized marijuana, but I'll prepare my arguments and I'll have you back. But on the other stuff, I find a lot of common ground. Um, do you think Americans and consumers generally have an appetite to make the tough decisions that will bring us back from the brink? I don't see that out there. I mean, this is not like World War II where we had war bonds and victory gardens. Nobody wants any personal pain to get us to a better place.
Yeah, that's a good point. No, nobody's honestly, if you think about somebody that's, let's say, 30, 35, their entire adult life, interest rates were pushed down to essentially zero. So they've never lived in a world based on savings and production. Like if you can go get a free loan, if you can get an interest-free loan for a couple years to buy a diamond ring, what reason would you have to spend those couple years saving your money and learning about savings and then having the money to pay for that diamond ring? It really has these long-term implications that people haven't thought out. And it's not just interest rates, it's just the way that government schools teach history and the way that the media shows what's going on in the world. Everything's presented that the government's the solution and that you can't trust markets and free markets, and that's one of the reasons we made this project was there was a big documentary on the BBC in like 1979 blaming all the inflation in the 70s on the free market. And so Milton Friedman wrote a book and made this series called Free to Choose. And that was basically his defense of the market to try to educate people. And so that's kind of what we're doing now. But when our savings rate is basically non-existent in the
Yeah,
United States, and you look at other places like China, where, I don't know what it is exactly now. I know it used to be like 30%,
yeah.
and people are actually saving money and they're buying gold and silver. Like all this run up in the gold market, that's not from retail people buying in the United States. That's from Asia and overseas. So we haven't even seen people start shifting their portfolio into gold as far as people's retirement accounts here and everything. In fact, my mom was talking to her advisor at Fidelity, and she asked him about using her IRA to purchase some gold and silver and I'm not sure if he meant just physical gold and
Hmm.
silver or what, but his response was, no one has asked me that in 15 years. And that's his job.
Wow,
So,
interesting.
so yeah, I really think you're right. Like there's not the education here. That doesn't mean that like people aren't going to be woken up to it. I think especially these last few years, people have really started to see, okay, wait, maybe we can't just print money and pay people to sit at home. Maybe we do need to work. And, that doesn't mean that we're just going to be able to fix all these issues real quick in the short term. But I do think we're going to see more of a big cultural shift. And I like to point to school choice because 10
Hmm.
years ago, nobody thought in a million years school choice would take off in the US. I mean, I was a huge proponent of it, but I didn't think it had any chance just because everybody in the United States is so pro public school. They don't want to admit that maybe their education wasn't this perfect, nostalgic, ideal uh, case. And what a lot of them don't realize is that with George Bush's No Child Left Behind, everything has become so much about standardized tests anymore. The education people are getting now isn't the education that they got growing up. But
And
I think it's something
you're
that
talking about charter schools here, Jimmy, right?
yeah.
Yeah,
The
exactly.
idea that like with welfare, or food stamps. I mean, let's say the government started grocery stores in each community and said, if you live near this grocery store, that's the one you have to go to. That's where you have to use your food stamps.
Hmm.
And we're going to tell you exactly what you can buy, and it's going to be a one size fits all for everybody. And what we're seeing with school choice is the idea that you give the money to the parents, they pick the school. And man, if that doesn't open up competition and, actually give some accountability to the schools, I don't know what else will. And the big problem is so much money is sent to the state, sent to DC. By the time it gets back to your school, it's all gone to administrative stuff. And so by doing it this way, the schools that your kids are going to are getting more of the money, but the way they have it set up is to try to bail out the public schools is the public schools still get a cut. So the amount they were spending on each child, you don't get all of that. You get a portion of it, and then the public school still gets the rest of that money. So they're getting more money per student, but they're not teaching the kids that the families don't want them there. And that's something Ron Paul had a big influence on me, John Taylor Gatto, and public school wasn't even an option to me for my kids. Like, and it goes way back. It's not like just recent. If you look at the start of public schools, they're trying to make factory workers. They're trying to get people to submit to the system to either be soldiers or factory workers, or they're trying to convert people and turn them into Christians, or, like with the Indians, American Indians hate public schools because when they put public schools on the Indian land, the whole idea was to get you to deny your culture and your worldviews to go to what the state wanted. And what the state wanted was you to be part of society the way they view it. And, they're trying to get, like, for example, with Indians, the women were doing the farming and the men were doing the hunting in some tribes. And they would say, no, the men need to be farmers. And when you do that, obviously you're going to have conflict. And it's obviously not the most efficient way, going back to that grocery store analogy I was using.
Yeah, so respect our culture, but at the same time, we are living in America. We're U.S. citizens. Many of I am, you are. So we do fly the U.S. flag, obviously, right? We're patriotic, or do you have a different view on that?
Well, I think the flag means different things to different people. To my dad, the flag represented freedom and small government and, what he viewed the United States. But the flag in the Middle East represents a completely different thing to the people that have been
Hmm.
bombed for the last 25 years. So I view it as, I believe in America. I love America. But that's a very separate thing from the government and what they do. And what you were talking about earlier with the Federal Reserve, possibly having a digital currency and having an even greater role in our market, that's not the American flag. That's not the
Mm,
America that
no.
people think of when they look back.
I had a fascinating, amusing encounter recently in a government office. It was a DMV. I won't say where it was because my life might be threatened. But we were lining up for at least an hour, organizing the paperwork. Uh, some of the staff were wonderful, but a lot of them were really hostile, pushing us, go here, go there. Oh, you don't have your this license, you don't have that, ba 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 ba. It was massively disorganized, and that's a whole separate discussion. I ended up going back twice on the one day to get another piece of paperwork, and I quibbled with the one of the officials. I says, "No, the paper here says that I'm qualified to get the paperwork I came here for today and walk home and all of that." He says, "No, no, 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 no. We're the government. We know what we're doing." And I said back to him, "That's the problem." So I thought back to Ronald Reagan, government is not the solution. Government is the problem.
Yeah, that reminds me of the movie Brazil. Have you seen the movie Brazil back from the 80s?
I've seen it. I've seen the
It's been a long
trailers and
time,
whatnot.
but yeah,
Yeah.
I recently watched that, and it really stuck out to me just how well that film shows bureaucracy and all that. And I recently got a ticket for rolling through a stop sign. I was driving Uber part-time. I do that as a way of supplementing my freelance video production work sometimes. And I was driving drunk people home from the bar at 1:30 in the morning. Yes, I'm making money, but I'm also doing a service to the community, like keeping the road safer by
Yeah.
having people not driving drunk. And I got pulled over by a cop, which I've been hassled by the police quite a bit in my life. And I got pulled over by a cop and just no discretion. He gave me a ticket for rolling through the stop sign, and it was $210.
Oh my
Now, I
gosh.
got one back in 2004, 2005 when I was in high school, and it was $60. And so you look at, okay, is this a price that reflects supply and demand, or is it like everything else with the government where it's completely arbitrary? And the answer is it's completely arbitrary. Like at one point, when the housing crash happened, the state of Iowa, the state governments too have budget crises where they have all this revenue coming in during the boom time and they think, oh, we can spend all this money. But then when the crash comes and less business is going on, that means there's inherently less tax revenue coming in. And so Iowa had this budget crisis. And so they just took all their fines and fees and just across the board just doubled them. So none of these
Wow.
prices or decrees by the government are based on supply or demand or individuals voluntarily choosing to transact with each other. It's all this top-down, one size fits all, and it's all based on force.
What's at stake today in the US under the Trump administration? You see where they were trying to cut back on their Doge, reform the Department of Education. We have the tariffs, which you disagree with. Um, but we're at a turning point. Where could this end up, and what's your view on it? Where do you see it going?
Yeah, that's a great question. I did not vote for Donald Trump. I actually did not vote in this election. But it's like with anyone. You mentioned earlier my production company is called Let Us Disagree Films, and my podcast is Let Us Disagree with Jimmy Morrison. And the idea behind that is just that if you sit down and talk to anybody long enough, eventually you're gonna find things you disagree on. Like nobody, even libertarians, even Republicans, like nobody within these little groups agrees with anyone 100%. Everybody has their own interpretations. And so by 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 having a president that just dictates all these things, regardless of who it is, I'm gonna have a bunch of problems with him,
Mm.
And I think people are very desperate, and so I think a lot of people are just they realize how bad the situation is, and they're just looking for someone to do something. But the problem is, I think Donald Trump has the record to show that he's not going to do it. And, people point to, oh, when he ran in 2016, he said, oh, the stock market's a bubble, the Federal Reserve is lowering interest rates. That's so terrible. But like any politician, when he got into office, he immediately flipped the script and said, the Fed needs to lower interest rates. And just imagine how great my economy would be if the Fed had lowered interest rates. And so we've seen that again with when he was elected recently. He's already calling for the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates. And so I don't think he or anybody else is going to be able to turn this ship. It is just too big of a system. There are too many things in place incentivizing it to keep going. And I'll praise Doge and everything they're trying to do. I'm not going to criticize them for trying to cut spending, but the reality is, they can't do anything. Like they're making these recommendations for a small amount of cuts. Like the cuts they're talking about, they're great, but they're not gonna solve the budget. And even that, the Republicans just go in and team up with the Democrats and pass a budget bill that throws a bunch of that stuff back in there. And so we're not seeing spending come down. One of the things we point to in the first film was that there was a depression in 1920. but people don't hear about it because they cut government spending in half. They
Mm.
let interest rates go up. They dealt with the problem, actually faced the consequences of that distorted economy, and it was over within a year and a half and allowed them to have a sustainable foundation. Now, they didn't continue that, obviously, but that's what we need to have happen here. And there's just no political capital to do it. So if we can't even barely cut the budget when we have, a $2 trillion deficit, $2.5 trillion deficit, like that's insane. We're screwed. I mean, I hate to say it, but like we're not going to be able to just get somebody in and fix these problems when we have a system that is in that bad of shape. And a big part of the problem is a big chunk of the budget, like two-thirds of the budget, is mandatory spending.
Yep.
And so they've made all these promises with Social Security and Medicare and everything. And what you mentioned earlier, unfunded liabilities, and that's the idea that they've made all these promises going forward. So even if they don't pass new budgets, it's just going to keep going up because all those promises are built into the system. And nobody, like, if nobody's going to cut the non-mandatory spending, certainly nobody's going to cut the mandatory spending where the root of the problem is. And one of the things we talk about in the third film, The Bigger Bubble, is Social Security. And when you see numbers about the sustainability of Social Security, know that just like inflation, just like government output, they use GDP. I like to look at Mark Skousen's gross output. But when you look at government numbers, they are bullshit. Like, let's be real. So with Social Security, they say the reason that Social Security isn't going to run out for 10, 15 years or whatever it is because they have a trust fund. But what is that trust fund full of? It's full of treasuries. So they took the money that was left over after paying out Social Security beneficiaries each year and put it in this trust fund, but they didn't leave it there. They took it out and spent it on other things to make the budget look like it wasn't as bad. So they spent all the money they were supposed to be saving, and it was a Ponzi scheme anyway. So it's not like they were saving enough to actually pay it out. But the little bit that they were saving in this trust fund, they spent it all already. So when they point to the trust fund, they say, "Oh, it has this much money in it." So no, it doesn't. It has IOUs in it. It has government debt in it. So it's just, I mean, it's such a unbelievable system that we live in, and even like the banking system. Like when I first learned about that, like I didn't believe that banks were set up the way they were. I assumed like you put your money in it and you could get it back. But it's just this fractional reserve system that's built on leverage, and they say that the FDIC guarantees the bank deposits, so we're all going to be fine. But even that is a fractional reserve system. So the amount of money the FDIC has, I mean, they don't have the money to cover all the
Mm.
bank deposits. So it's one of those things where as the boom goes on, it looks like, oh, this is great, everything's going on. I'm drinking my coffee. I'm okay. But when the crashes happen, man, they can really spiral out of control quickly when if a bank collapses, you're losing all that leverage that was put into the system. And I know I'm going on a lot, but just one other thing I'll say about that is like if you look at student loans, like all that student loan debt, like they'll go out and talk about, oh, we don't want to have all the student loan debt. But the fact of their worldview is if you got rid of it, if it was all paid off immediately or something, like they think that would be bad for the economy. They would want it to be replaced with more debt, whether it's student or something else. And
Mm.
so just like we saw with the housing bubble with government guaranteeing mortgages, we see it with student loans where the government guarantees student loans. And it's it's not the free market America that we grew up thinking that we were a part of.
Well, we're the we have the reserve currency of the globe, the major one, so we print ourselves out of debt. You seem to present two startling and disturbing options here. One, a depression in the US, maybe globally, which nobody has the appetite for. That would get us out of our trouble.
Mhm.
Some people would say that's an awful thing to wish for, Jimmy Morrison, but that's what you're saying. Or we'll just struggle on, and then some kind of a a government seizure of everything and a massive loss of personal freedoms? Is that the two scenarios we're now facing?
Yeah, I mean, long term, I don't think that's necessarily going to happen tomorrow or anything. But what we're talking about with the government debt going on and with interest on the debt getting bigger and bigger, you mentioned it's bigger than defense spending, and there's just no way out when you look at that. Like they're gonna if they're not willing to make the cuts, which they aren't, they're going to print the money. And so in the short term, I believe we're in a recession already. In the short term, and I could be wrong about that, I don't claim to have all the answers. But in the short term, as this recession hits and people spend less, inflation is coming down right now. And, maybe we're not going to have stagflation, which is high inflation, high unemployment at the same time. But in the long run, I just don't see how we can avoid it with all the distortions that they made and with what we were talking about with the stuff that's built into the budget. Because if you have a $2.5 trillion deficit right now and over $1 trillion just being spent on interest on the debt, what are we going to do if interest rates keep going up? Because then interest on the debt takes over the entire budget, or the deficit takes over the entire budget. So I want to like emphasize that yes, like I believe people don't realize how bad it could be. Like we've kind of had this cushy economy even with these crashes, but I I think it's going to be bad. And I don't want to end on that note because I am optimistic about technology, about
Well, with
people. I
AI, of
believe,
course. Yes, yes.
yeah, but even like people and relationships, like it's easy, I'm 38. It's easy to look at young people and see them just scrolling through videos all the time and think, man, like uh they're how are you going to even have a conversation with people if they have the attention span of 2 seconds, but I mentioned that I started driving Uber pretty recently, and I've been amazed at the conversations I've had with all these young people. And so I am optimistic about humanity and our ways of finding methods of getting around government control. But man, it's really scary when you live through something like 2020, where you can see a government telling people whether they can go to church or not. And,
Yes, yes.
America has this free speech and freedom ideology kind of built into it. And that's one of the things I love about it. But when we released our films, on Facebook, they made it so you could not post a link to our website. Our website is letusdisagree.com. And through 2021, if you posted a link to letusdisagree.com, it wouldn't let you make the post. It would say it was spam. And I don't know exactly why that is. What we found with the Twitter files is that the government was directly telling Facebook and Twitter like what to censor. And one of the departments that was telling them what to censor was the Department of the Treasury. So I don't know if we were
Mm.
targeted for that or what. Fortunately, Tom Woods had someone on his newsletter that works for Facebook, and we weren't able to do anything from outside the company, but somebody filed an internal appeal, and you can thankfully post links to our website now. But like it just shows that how easily these freedoms can be eroded when the government, has the capabilities that they have. Like what we saw with Snowden, the stuff that he was talking about, they would go into Verizon and make them do all this stuff and tap into all this stuff. And then they'd say, okay, here's a gag order. You cannot legally tell anyone about this. And so, how are we supposed to function in a society where, we have secret police and secret courts and things like that? It's not the path forward. And I hope that we're able to find pockets and use technology like the internet to subvert that because I think it's one of the most important parts of society.
Want to just do a quick sum up here, Jimmy. You're based out of Iowa. You've been a filmmaker for many years. You went to college, then you had your epiphany when you read that book on economics. You've more than three movies. You have other movies to your credits, and you have your own website. There's been great reception for the first movie, The Housing Bubble. Where can people watch these movies? Again, The Housing Bubble, fall of 2008, that's going to be premiered at the Freedom Fest in Palm Springs, California, and then the other one is coming soon, The Bigger Bubble. Where can people watch them?
That's right. Yeah, if they want to come to Palm Springs, Jim Rogers and Peter Schiff and Steve Forbes and myself are going to be on the panel after the film. That's part of the Anthem Film Festival. So I'm really excited about that. But if you want, you don't have to wait for that. You can watch the first two movies now. If you go to the fall of 2008.com, it allows you to purchase each film. They're only $10. Everybody that advised me on this project said charge $20 per film.
Mm.
But Peter Schiff actually encouraged me to charge $10 because we want to get these films out. And yes, I'm not giving them away for free. I've worked 14 years on this project, on and off, of course, but people would be surprised how much of that was actually full time and above. But yeah, the fall of 2008.com, you can get the housing bubble, you can get the fall of 2008, and then the bigger bubble, we've already finished editing. We're just finishing up the music. And so hopefully we'll have that out this fall or maybe in the spring, depending on how our release goes. But my website is letusdisagree.com. You can see my podcast. We have interviews with Jim Rogers and Peter Schiff and Ron Paul and Gary Johnson so far on the podcast. And then there's lots of short films, music videos. I actually dropped out of college to pursue film. And so I kind of got my start doing music videos, filming this band, The Color Pharmacy on the road. And so our first film that we made was with Jake Dilley, he's our composer and sound designer for this trilogy. But his first project that he made, he co-directed with McManus Woodend, which people will recognize as the Geico caveman from the
Yep,
Geico commercials.
I remember that.
And it's called
He's got a
Rocksteady,
great,
and it's
he's a
actually
very animated person. He's
oh,
a,
he's great. He's
yeah.
great. And it's not a documentary, it's a mockumentary. And the premise is that two brothers from Fairfield, Iowa, which is where the Maharishi University is, it's a big meditation hub. These two naive brothers decide that they're going to take their song and dance band down to South by Southwest in Austin, Texas. They take an RV down there. And the idea is they think it's like American Idol, where you just go in front of some people and play, and then they say, "Okay, you made it. Here's your check," you know. And so they end up obviously going on a much bigger adventure than that. We took an RV down to Texas and then over to LA and then back to Iowa, and it was quite the adventure. I think people will enjoy it. The an hour out of Fairfield, I smoked a deer with the RV, just completely smoked it, completely wiped out the front of the vehicle. And so we had an extra day and a half to get there to Austin, but we had to get there because they had actual stage time at South by Southwest, so we had to like be able to film. It was a key point of the film. And so I drove all over Iowa to multiple junkyards finding parts and then spent all day replacing the radiator and the transmission cooler. And my brother's a mechanical engineer that lived about an hour away from there. And so he came down and helped us finish up. And we were able to get to Austin, I think it was 27 minutes before they were supposed to go on stage. So that was quite the experience. The other big project I'll point people to is our producer, David Tice. He produced Soul Surfer, about the girl that got her arm bit off by a shark. She was a surfer.
Mm.
And he directed a movie called Grid Down, Power Up. And Dennis Quaid is the narrator, and
Oh,
it's about threats to the electrical grid,
oh wow.
whether they be, foreign or solar or all these things. And it's really a fascinating film that gets into what would happen if our electrical grid went down.
Wow.
And so people can check that out at griddownpowerup.com or through my website, letusdisagree.com. But that was a fun one to work on. I was a script consultant, so I'm really proud of the work I did helping with that. And then Jake Dilley and I did all the motion graphics for the film as well.
Great stuff here, Jimmy. With your permission, I'd like to play your trailer at the end of this, the YouTube version of our interview today. And people listening on audio, go to our YouTube channel. I have your permission. There's no copyright issues, I presume.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And so to reach you, anybody listening or watching, to reach you, go to your website. Is that the best way to make a contact?
Yeah, if you go to letusdisagree.com, you can email me, Jimmy at letusdisagree.com. On social media, I unfortunately put a lot of my time and investment into Facebook, and that after 2020, 2021, I don't like to use it as much anymore. But so I've kind of switched over to X, and so you can find me at x.com/Jim Morrison Film. And we also have pages for the film under the bigger bubble. So if you search for the bigger bubble, you can find that. And that way, that posts a lot more about what's going on in the economy. Whereas my account, I post about the documentaries, but I also post about my other work as well.
Jimmy Morrison, thank you.
Thank you. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's great. That was good.
All this has happened before, and it will all happen again.
The reality is we have gone from a stock market bubble. Now we have a housing bubble, and when it breaks, whatever causes it to pop, then a lot of people are going to find out, oh my God, not only are my stocks down, my house is down too, and now what do I do?
Charlie, this was the day we were afraid to wake up to, the bankruptcy of one major Wall Street investment bank, the shotgun wedding of another.
Can't be distracted. What's going on with the war? What's wrong with the economy? Stop worrying about that.
They're not only doing the wrong thing, they're doing exactly the opposite of the right thing.
We got into our mess by spending too much money, running up too much debt, and printing too much money, and that's exactly what we're doing.
Which, by the way, would seem how we got into this state of affairs in the first place.
You have to work for money, kids.
No, you don't. It comes from the machine in the wall. I've seen it. Yeah, you just have to push buttons.